All right, thanks everyone for attending the last weekly webinar of 2013. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. This week's webinar is third-party web services. I'm going to be showing you a handful of projects I have here that connect to a variety of web services. We'll run them, see what they do, take a look at some of the code, cover quite the gamut. There's a lot of different ways to do this sort of thing. And we'll take questions, which reminds me to bring up, if you have questions anytime while I'm talking, by all means, just type them into the question window. I will see them. I'll address them as appropriate when I can. So let's go ahead and get started here. Now, the first thing to understand when you're dealing with any sort of web services is how the communication is done. There's technologies you can use. There's stuff in Xojo you can use. In particular, things that are often used when communicating with web services are the HTTP socket control, the HTML viewer. You'll often transmit information using XML or JSON. JavaScript is also something that you may find you have to use. There's a protocol for communicating with web services called SOAP, for Simple Object Access Protocol. Xojo has some built-in methods for dealing with those type of web services. But more commonly these days, you often see web services that are built using REST, whose acronym always escapes me. Yeah, I don't even remember that one off the top of my head. But it just uses HTTP to do the communication. OAuth is another common thing you see for authenticating with web services. And in addition to HTTP socket, curl is another method for doing communication that you can use within Xojo, often through a shell or a command line or something like that. So those are pretty much a wide list of some of the protocols and tools and things that you can use. So let's take a look here at a few projects in Xojo. So we'll take a look at this first one here. And should see Xojo on the screen. I will point out that this is 2013 release 4, which was just announced today, came out earlier this morning my time. So if you haven't grabbed that, by all means, you can head on over to our website and grab the latest release of Xojo. So this app, when I run it here, I'll just type an address in here. I don't want to type my address. I will type, let's see, Fenway Park, Boston, Massachusetts. And you can see it pulls up a Google map and displays it right here in the window. In fact, this is very similar to the map viewer control that's included with Web Edition, with your web applications. I'm getting a couple reports that sound might be going in and out. I don't exactly know why that would be. I don't see any issues here on my end. All the levels look proper. Hopefully that is not an issue on the recording and it clears itself up. I'm checking my transmissions on the cable modem. That also looks fine. Hopefully this is isolated and not a permanent thing. All right, so this is the showing a map using in a window, similar to how the map viewer control works for web applications. So how is this implemented? Well, you can see right here there's a giant HTML viewer that is on the window. And this is actually this Google Map Viewer, which is a subclass of HTML viewer. And we'll open that up so you can see what it has here. And it just has a couple things on it. First, it has a method that's called that just substitutes the address into some text, which is in this constant here. And then it loads the page. And the source for this is right here at this URL on Google's developer page. But the heart of this is essentially this JavaScript. And you can see this is from Google's Hello World example for how to use Google Maps. And it's JavaScript that's embedded in an HTML page that calls the Maps API and displays a specific map. And you can see what I did is I took their Hello World example, and they had it hard-coded, or they had something else here. But I just put in right here a little replaceable string that I can then substitute whatever the address is that the user typed. So it gets stuffed into the JavaScript. And then the update map command essentially stuffs that address into there and then loads the page. So this is incredibly simple, but all of a sudden it gives you access to Google Maps that you can now use in your desktop app. So it's a great way to get that ability. And if you've ever used or checked out the Eddie's Electronics reference app that's included in the Xojo examples, this particular thing is used there to display the addresses for the customers as you click on them. All right, so this is a Google Maps example, and this is using just an HTML viewer and some JavaScript that was essentially grabbed from Google's developer page. Now, this sort of stuff can be done at varying levels. Obviously, Google has a full API for their Google Maps. Depending on how you're using it, they want you to sign up for an account so that you have particular keys that you can substitute and that sort of stuff so they can track who's using it and whatnot. But this is the basics for how you can hook that up in one way. Now let's take a look at using Yahoo for something. All right, so this app is just going to hit a Yahoo service that pulls back the current weather conditions for the location. This particular location is a Google thing, a WOEID that they call. It's not actually a zip code or anything like that, but you can, I think they have a page up that gives you what these numbers are for various locations, so you can plug that in. And you can see right here in Maine in the US where I am, it is 11 degrees Fahrenheit, which is in the negatives for Celsius. It's pretty cold here. It was actually 10 below 0 Fahrenheit this morning when I got up. And you can see what this service is returning is a bunch of XML. And there's a lot more stuff in here than what I am just displaying here because I'm just pulling out a few choice things from the XML. But you can see there's all kinds of stuff in here, full forecast for the week with high and low temperatures and that sort of thing. It's all kind of neat information. This, again, is a very simple app, so we can see here what this looks like. This is using an HTTP socket. And it's, just hitting up the URL for the service that you want to access. And sometimes the hard part is figuring out, where is the service that you want to access. You may be building an app and you say, all right, I want to get, accurate weather forecasts. How can I do that? Or weather conditions or whatnot. And, usually you're going to hit up probably the major sites that provide this sort of information, see if they have an API that's easily accessible that you can integrate into your application. So here it's just creating what the URL is, creating an HTTP socket, doing a very simple synchronous get with a 5-second timeout, gets back the information. This is an important next step. When you get back the information, you're going to want to specify the encoding of it. It's almost always going to be UTF-8, but by default, because the encoding came from outside of Xojo, it's not going to be specific. And you want to be very specific as to what the encoding is so you can parse it properly, and so things display as you expect. And then here it's just displaying the XML that was returned in that giant text area so that it can be reviewed. And then because we know that it's an XML document that came back, it can be worked with using the XML document class. So here we create an instance of the XML document class, and then we attempt to load the XML that came back into it. And something you're always going to want to do when you're loading XML is always wrap it in a try-catch in case for some reason the XML is malformed, or, and this happens pretty common with most web services, is they don't always return back XML necessarily if there's some sort of error condition. So it's possible you get back XML if the request succeeded. It's possible if the request failed, you don't get back XML. Maybe you just get back an error message or an error code or something like that. So that could raise an XML exception. If you try to load an error code as an XML file, well, that's going to raise an exception. But that's the sort of thing you may not know unless the person who created the API has this stuff all documented. You may figure it out by testing, trial and error, purposely sending bad data in to see what you get back, that sort of thing. And once we know that it's properly loaded into an XML document, well, then you can process it as you would any other XML document. In this particular case, I'm not doing anything fancy about the processing. I'm just searching for some item nodes and then looping through them and looking for the specific things I wanted to display that were embedded in the XML. All right, I'm just scanning over the questions here. Tim has asked if these are web apps or desktop apps. The first two that I've shown are desktop apps, but it doesn't really matter. All of these communication can be done using either web or desktop apps. Certainly doing the map viewer thing doesn't make much sense as a web app because we already include a control for you that does that and much more. But this weather technique could certainly be done in a web app. Heck, you could even do it in a console app, really. No restrictions there. And Steve is asking if the demo apps will be available after the webinar. Yes, they will. Some of these are already available in the Xojo examples, not quite all of them, but if you do go to examples, communication, internet, in this folder here, several of the ones we're going to look at are in here. The Google Maps one is not. I think this Yahoo weather one maybe is. Or maybe not. Anyway, yes, they'll all be made available on the usual location, which I'll show you at the end of the webinar. And let's see here. Eli is asking about a question about the XQL command. And this right here uses what's called XPath or XQuery to query XML. It's pretty standard stuff. You can go to that method. You go to XML. I forget if that's on XML node. It might be on XML node.xql in the language reference. Guess it didn't find it. Yeah, XML node. So you can see here, there's a couple links if you're not familiar with the syntax for searching XML that you can go through that'll show you that. It's industry standard stuff. And very handy for finding things quickly in XML when you don't want to have to bother traversing the entire XML structure. All right, so that's the Yahoo one, and that one is making use of the HTTP socket and using XML for the data. All right, the next one here we'll take a peek at is going to use SOAP. And I could use these both in a row. For example, the prior one got the current temperature here in Fahrenheit, and I could have fed it to this SOAP service to convert the Fahrenheit temperature to Celsius, which is balmy right now. See what it was this morning. Now, obviously, this is a relatively silly example because converting to Celsius from Fahrenheit is easily done using a simple mathematical formula, but nonetheless, this shows the technique. And as Eli is reminding me, minus 40 Fahrenheit equals minus 40 Celsius. And I don't want to be here when it hits minus 40 Fahrenheit or minus 40 Celsius. That's far too cold. All right, so you can see how this works. Again, pretty simple. The important thing is this WSDL, which is SOAP syntax for how you call the SOAP web service. And this particular one here, I snagged off of this website. There's all kinds of websites that, if you do a little Google searching, provide free SOAP services that you can play around with. The big problem I've found is that those services, because they're free, tend to go up and down. You know, they'll be online for a while, then they'll come offline, or they'll be really sluggish or slow. So you may not want to, you know, have any business critical stuff relying on SOAP web services that you yourself are not responsible for. But there are quite a few out there to play with. A specific example of when I ran into that is I did a demo similar to this at our conference back in April, I guess it was. And the night before, the evening before my session, I went through and tested all my examples, and my SOAP example, of course, failed even after having worked the day before. It failed the night before and continued to fail the day of the session. So I had to quickly scamper around and find a different SOAP service that I could make use of and still wrap a reasonable example around. So the important thing is figuring out what this is here. Some of these, let's see if this comes up here in Safari. Some of them give you, this one isn't one of them, it looks like. Let's try the whole WSDL. Yeah, depending on, here we go. This is what I was trying to do. This seems to be pretty common. You can see by this extension here with the ASMX, I believe this indicates this is written using .NET. They'll put up a page that kind of defines the available functions or methods that you can call on the web service. And then you can often click them to get examples for how you might call them and what they might return and test them out and that sort of thing. So all useful stuff when you're attempting to build this sort of interface. All right, going back here. So you can see this is just creating a SOAP method using the supplied URL for the WSDL. And then that is called like so. You use the SOAP method, and then you can provide the actual name of the method that the web service has implemented. And this will be figured out dynamically when the application runs. You supply in the parameters that you need, and it's going to return the result. And in this case, the result is simply displayed. Let's see here. I got a question from Tim. If there's a SOAP API that requires a key of some kind to get authenticated. Yeah, well, again, that's going to depend on how the SOAP API is implemented. I mean, you may be able to pass it in as a parameter, I suppose. I don't really, that wasn't in any of the trial ones that were being playing around with. Certainly the, what am I trying to do here? Bring this up. The SOAP implementation has a few other things that I didn't make use of in that example. There's some parameters you can specify, timeouts, and other things that may be necessary for more, complicated SOAP methods. So that would be something to look at. The other thing is, generally speaking, in this day and age, it seems like SOAP web services are not nearly as common as they once were, and most are using the more typical REST type that just use simple HTTP for communications. So that's what you would have to check for these. So this example of the temperature converter is showing how you might use SOAP to connect to something. All right, this next one will be a little harder to demo, but I can at least show you some of the code. And this example uses a service called Twilio to send a text message to your phone. And Twilio, let's see if I can bring up their website here. Actually, is it developer.twilio maybe? So these guys provide a pretty powerful REST API for doing phone type communications, including sending text messages. You can actually, and another example I'll bring up here is you can actually have the Twilio service essentially answer phone calls and then do things based on button presses on the keypad and that sort of thing. So pretty neat stuff. You can sign up there for a free trial account. They give you some small amount of credit on your account so you can test out things such as this. So you can see here this particular example. First of all, doesn't run on Windows because it is, or Linux. Actually, probably would run on Linux. I just haven't. Actually, I read it wrong. It doesn't run on Windows. It runs on OS 10 and Linux because it uses the curl shell command to actually communicate, in this case, with Twilio because of all the values that it has to pass in and the API protocol that it's using. It's not working with the built-in HTTP socket of Xojo, which only implements HTTP 1.0. Oh, and I'm getting here. Thank you, Jim, for reminding me yet again. This never seems to sink in that REST stands for Representational State Transfer. I never remember that because that's just a bad acronym. All right. So anyway, the heart of this is done using the curl command, and essentially this is just packaged up as a string, stuffing in the appropriate parts that are needed based on the Twilio documentation. So it's calling the specific URL that they provide, stuffing in specific parts of your developer account with Twilio. They give you these really long hexadecimal keys that are used for your account ID and your authorization tokens so that it can verify that it's coming from you, and they can, hitch that up to your account. And then you encode in the from number that it's coming from and the to number that you're sending the text to, and then the text of the message itself. And then this just runs the curl command on the shell and then gets back the result, which will be a bunch of stuff that you can see here. So we can try running this. I'll get a text message on my phone, but none of you will really be able to see it, unlike when I do this demo in front of a live studio audience. So here we go. I just got a text sent from my Twilio trial account from Xojo. And if we look, go back to here, you can see the information it sent back. Not terribly a lot of stuff there, but it tells you at least that the message was sent properly. And this sort of thing is a great thing that you can add to apps, for notifications, who knows what. People love getting text messages for stuff like this. So this gives you the ability to use a web service to send a text message using your desktop or web Xojo apps. And this example is included in the Xojo examples at the moment. I believe it is in here. Yes, the Twilio SMS one is here, and also the answer call one, which we'll look at in a moment. And it looks like the SOAP one is as well. So that's an example of how Twilio can be used. And let's see, Val here is mentioning that curl can be downloaded for Windows, and yes, I should have mentioned that. It's just not built in to Windows like it is on OS 10 and Linux, so you actually have to put it somewhere. Certainly, if you're building your own app, you could, I don't know the distribution rules regarding this curl thing, but it's possible that it's open source. It's possible that you can just include it with your app and then have it available right alongside it so that you could use this on all three platforms. And Ken is reminding me, not reminding me, but noting, he must be an expert in this Twilio stuff or the curl command, that a -s parameter added here will suppress some of the other headers and just return back the XML. And if you actually were expecting some XML results that you wanted to process, that would be very handy so that you wouldn't have to attempt to do string manipulation to strip out stuff that you don't want. All right, let me close this one. Related to this one is the Twilio Answer Call app, and this is a web app. And the way this works is Twilio provides you with a phone number that you can call for testing purposes. And when you call this phone number, you can hitch up on the back end of Twilio's website. You can tell it to make specific calls to your own web services. In this particular case, I have here a Xojo web app with code in the handle special URL event handler so that it can respond to requests, HTTP requests. And in this particular case, when you call, once this is hooked up using the Twilio's control panel on their website, and you've deployed this app on some sort of public server, when you call the number, Twilio sends the HTTP command, as you specified, over here to the Xojo app, which ends up coming in through this handle special URL event handler. And then what you would actually plug into the control panel is something along these lines, but you'd use the actual URL of wherever you've deployed this so that their services can actually find it. And then it just parses in the request that came in. And in this particular case, I'm just stripping out, I'm just asking for the zip code of the caller. They provide in their packet of information, all kinds of information about the caller, including the phone number, of course, and the zip code of the location that the call originated. And then this actually calls a web service that gets the temperature. And you can see here, and this is using SOAP. So this is kind of doing two things. This is acting as a web service itself and then calling a web service to get a temperature. And then it's sending a response back to Twilio using their specific syntax, which they call TWIML. And you just construct it using strings. And it looks a little bit like XML. And they have specific commands in here. So we're sending back a response. We use the say command that's part of Twilio, and then you can just type text and it'll read it back. So essentially the gist of this is that after you call the phone number, this method is called in Xojo. It constructs a string that says, welcome to Xojo, today is, and you'll notice it's spelled Xojo so that it sounds correctly by the computer voice that's reading it. And it says today is and includes the date, and the time is and includes the time. And then it adds the temperature in the zip is the temperature. So you'll call the number and you'll hear the computer voice say all this back to you. So this example is also included in the Xojo examples. It's a little harder to actually test this because you actually have to build the web app and deploy it somewhere so that when you plug in the information into the Twilio control panel, you can give it an actual URL that it can find. But it's pretty cool. All right, I'm checking the questions here. Oh yes, and I got a few people reminding me that the MBS plugins also includes a curl implementation or a class or something in there as well. So that might be another alternative rather than firing off the shell if you have the MBS plugins. Oh, and I see another question here from Tim. If you have access to a REST API from Windows, how would you do it? I'm not sure I understand that question, Tim. I'm sorry. If you could maybe rephrase that. All right, so those are two Twilio examples, and those make use of curl. They make use of REST. This particular one is acting as a web service and then calling a web service itself. And speaking of acting as a web service, I'm going to show you how you can do that using your own apps. So let's see here. Open this one up. So much like that Twilio example was, you can create your own web service by creating web apps with Xojo and making use of this handle special URL event handler that's on the app class. And this event handler is called when you fire off a specific URL to your web app. So let's run this. So we'll see the web app is now running here. It's not really doing anything, but I can take this URL right here and I can put it, let's just put it in a completely different browser. All right. So each time, where's the refresh button in Chrome? Each time we issue the command, we get a different quote back. And that is calling this method. And all this method is doing here is generating a random number and then pulling a quote out of the array that there's 5 quotes here. And then stuffing it into an HTML document and returning that back so that it displays nicely in another web page like this. But you can also return whatever you wanted here. You could return XML, you could return JSON, you could really return whatever you want in whatever format you want. So if I open up this other project here, this is just a desktop project that will do the same thing. It will call that web service that's still running. And you can see here what it actually is getting back is the actual HTML. I just stuffed it here in the text area so you could see it. But you can see the actual HTML. So if this were an HTML viewer, I could display it right here. But if I were getting back XML, I could just, again, create a new XML document in Xojo, load the XML into that, and then process it that way. And then all of a sudden, I have all the data I need. And implementing something like this gives you the ability to create apps that can communicate with a centralized data source, if you will, regardless of the type of app. So you could have a Xojo web app that is accessing a database behind the scenes based on your request, packaging up the data as JSON or XML and sending it back. Then your desktop apps can request the information using a particular HTTP request. Your web apps could also request the information in that manner. And actually, apps written using anything could request the information in that manner. Because it's a nice standardized way of using essentially REST to send a request up and get your data back. Let's see, Tim has clarified what he was asking. Oh, yes, he was asking that is there a way to do this without using curl because Windows does not have curl. Yeah, and as we mentioned, you would have to use a different curl implementation on Windows, either the one in the Monkey Bread plugins, or you would find the curl implementation that can be downloaded for Windows and installed. But you wouldn't be able to use the HTTP socket, and this is for that specific example of Twilio that required features that the HTTP socket did not have built in. But yeah, there's almost always some solution that you can touch on for accessing what you need to access. All right, so that's the quote service. All right, the last thing I'm going to show you here is an in-progress kind of thing, and I didn't write it, so I won't be able to explain the code too well, but this will be fun to look at and will be made available. Hopefully this one works here. All right, this app here is supposed to let me send a tweet. If I can type it right. All right, yes. So there it is. So that's pretty darn cool. Tweeting from within Xojo. Twitter's API is not a simple thing. This project is actually from Stefan, our QA dude that does all the builds and the QA testing and whatnot, and he put together this Twitter project that allows you to actually pull back a list of tweets. As you saw there, it was showing my most recent tweet, or from my Twitter feed at the top, and it also allows me to post to my Twitter account. So let's just see here. Like I said, I didn't write this. I'm still going through it to get it cleaned up to be included in Xojo itself. But I expect it will be ready for the next release. It obviously did not make it for the R4 release that went out today, but I fully expect it will be in the first 2014 release. And kind of like you, I'm looking at some of this code for the first time. I only briefly got this to be able to clean it up so I could run a few things today and hitch it up to my account. But he's got a whole bunch of classes that are implemented here that allow the communication with Twitter. And in particular, the Twitter uses OAuth to authenticate. And I imagine, like I said, I haven't studied the code. Somewhere in here is some implementation of that that at least works with Twitter. I don't particularly think it's a generic implementation that would work with all OAuth systems. Twitter, when you have a developer account, requires all sorts of, again, these hexadecimal keys that are used to identify everything and to authorize yourself. So these are all assigned here. I have them all declared as constants in the app class for my account, which is what allows this to post to my personal Twitter account. And then there's other stuff that's called here to actually apparently pull back timeline information or whatnot. Where's the tweet window? So that opens up this thing. So apparently there's a method here called update that is sending the tweet along, and then it's refreshing the timeline window. I said once I get more time to study this, it'll probably be worth of a blog post as well to maybe explain how some of this works once I get it all figured out. But it will definitely be included in the next release of Xojo. And before that, I expect I'll also have this posted on alongside this webinar's recording as well. Maybe not initially when the recording gets available, but it should show up there fairly soon so that people can grab this before the next release of Xojo is available and play around with it. All right, Craig here's asking, in the example where I mentioned we could use a web service that doles out database requests, how secure can that be made? Well, certainly when you're dealing with web stuff, yes, security is obviously very important. How secure it can be made, I suppose, depends on your skills in that manner. You're probably going to want to, first of all, be using HTTPS for security. But it may not even matter if you're building an internal app, that's running on intranet or something like that, that's not exposed to the outside world. then your apps are pretty well isolated in that manner. I'm not really the security expert here at Xojo, so I can't talk to specifics about how you might secure your web apps in that manner. But obviously there are ways to do that so that it's behind the appropriate things, so that people can't just start sending requests off to your services and getting back data. That would obviously be very bad. Let's see here. Tim is just asking, going back to the curl thing, is the issue with having to use curl just a matter of us, Xojo, upgrading our HTTP socket? And yes, that's exactly the issue right now. The Xojo HTTP socket only implements the HTTP 1.0 protocol, and it also doesn't have as robust support for some of the secure HTTPS stuff as we might want. And it's on our to-do list for 2014 to get that socket updated to use HTTP 1.1 and all of the niceties that it's asked. And the big problem, most of the time, HTTP socket is going to work fine. But the problem is you run into some servers that, even though they got a request from something that specifies it only understands HTTP 1.0, will ignore that and still send back the information using HTTP 1.1, and that causes issues, obviously. So you'll often see this as, it could be considered a bug on the server side that the server is not responding to the request properly. But nonetheless, HTTP 1.1 is what is commonly used nowadays, and we do want to get our socket updated to that. All right, so this last one, using Twitter, which unfortunately I can't explain in great detail yet because I haven't had a chance to study it in great detail yet. But it is making use of curl, is using Twitter's REST API with OAuth. And if you, I think their developer page is dev.twitter.com. Yeah, so if you already have a Twitter account, I think you just sign in using your Twitter account, and then you can go through their section. If I remember the process properly, there's a section called apps that you can create an app, and then so what I did in my case is I created an app just called test Xojo or something like that, and that gave me all those 8 hexadecimal keys, the authorization codes and whatnot, that I just at that point cut and pasted into this project, and then it worked. And I know you're all dying to test out this Twitter thing, so I will do my best to get that up soon so that it is available for download for people to play with. All right, those are the examples that I was going to cover today. So now I'll hit on my usual spiel stuff here at the end. If you have any other questions, feel free to type them in. And I mentioned this at the beginning. I do want to remind again everyone, as it says up here at the top, that release 4 is available. So you certainly want to go ahead and grab that from the download page. I will point out that starting with release 4, we're no longer including localizations for European languages. Right now, the only localizations are included are Japanese and a couple dialects of Chinese, I believe. So that's more of a for your information kind of thing. Craig is asking if there's no survey. No, Craig, not today, no survey. I need to rework the surveys for the webinars that start in 2014. Which reminds me that I will now show you the list of the webinars that are coming up in January. Like I said, this is the last webinar of this year. There'll be none the next 2 weeks. But starting in January, we're going to hit the ground running, talking about IDE scripting. Pretty cool feature that probably not a lot of people are taking advantage of, and there's some neat stuff you can do here. So we'll cover some examples, show what that is, how it works, and some examples of how you might use it. And then jump into debugging. Get a lot of questions about debugging and best practices and how to use the debugger efficiently and the remote debugger and that sort of thing. Then we'll talk about designing a mobile web app, and this will be more specific about how you might design your UI to work well on small devices like phones. And then source control, always lots of questions about source control, so I'm going to cover the use of Subversion in Git. Subversion will be covered in a little bit more detail in Git, mostly just because I'm more familiar with it, but Git is pretty cool, so we'll cover that as well. And about a month or so ago, I did a SQLite webinar, and some of the feedback I got was that people really wanted to have a webinar that was just exclusively on SQLite itself, not even necessarily talking about Xojo, but just covering SQLite and all its features and capabilities and whatnot. So we're going to have a webinar about that. And then reporting and printing come up a lot, so that's coming up in February. And then Postgres, a great database server that everyone should check out. And I will remind everyone that after February, the end of March, is our 2014 Xojo Developer Conference in Las Vegas this year. You'll definitely want to head down there if you can make the trip. Las Vegas is pretty easy to get to, a lot of fun. This is a 3-day conference. There'll be about 38 sessions. Should be a blast. The session list is up here. I don't think the full schedule is up yet. Not yet, but that should be up soon, probably in early January. But the list of all the sessions is up, and you can certainly check out some of the topics, see what might be of interest to you. And lastly, I'd like to remind everyone about our forum. If you're not taking advantage of that, by all means do so. Forum.xojo.com. You just log in using your Xojo account and password. And you can take advantage of all the people that are on there that are happy to answer your questions. And I think just this past week, I hit the refresh button. Yes, we got over 4,000 people subscribed to the forum, which is great. And working on over 45,000 posts. And this forum just really came online for all our users in June when Xojo was released. Before that, it was just in beta testing with a much smaller group of people working on it. So it's been tremendously popular and active, and is a great resource for Xojo developers. All right, let me see if we got any other questions here. All right, Tim is asking if you embed the API keys into the code as constants, how hard would it be for a hacker to go in and get your API key? It wouldn't be hard at all. You don't want to embed them as constants just using plain text. That would be pretty easy for someone to extract. You would want to at the very least obfuscate them in some way. You might even want to come up with your own wouldn't be an encryption method necessarily, but you'll want to come up with some way that make these things very difficult to extract. Certainly not storing them in the original form would be one technique. There's lots of techniques for this problem in general. Obfuscating, breaking it into multiple pieces, and then combining it so that there's no one string in your app for anyone to find and decode. Lots of things there, but yeah, you want to have to spend some time figuring that out. Let's see, that brings up another question here from Lewis is asking, I want to go right here. For those of you that miss a webinar or want to rewatch one, they're always available here on this part of our documentation wiki, docs.xojo.com, in the video section, which you can access right from the homepage. Towards the bottom here, we have webinars, trainings, and tutorial videos. The localization one from last week is now online with its example project. So you can go ahead and grab that. You can also, if you just go right to YouTube, where we post all of ours, you can actually subscribe in YouTube as well to everything, to all the videos and whatnot, so that when new ones pop up, you're quickly notified of it. And Glenn is saying he's excited for the SQLite webinar and that he's already prepped for the conference because he's got tickets to Penn and Teller. Ah, that's awesome. I did not check to see who's going to be down in Las Vegas those weeks. Penn and Teller would probably be very fun. And Tim is asking on the forums if there's a link to your posts. And I think there is here in the, yeah, if you use this little thing, if you go to the filter thing and you pick author, and then you somehow get the member name here. You can get the posts that you started, which seems about right. I don't tend to start too many posts, mostly just replying to them. So yeah, certainly if you're, this little gadget here in the, on the forum provides all kinds of ways you can search and filter and find things that you might be interested in. So certainly check that out. And of course, you should be able to click on people's names and you can see activity and whatnot. All right, so that's all I had to cover today. Looks like that's it for questions. So I want to thank everyone for attending this week's webinar. Have a great holiday season if that's your thing, and certainly have a wonderful new year as it starts up, and we will continue these webinars in January. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.